Nearly 100 years ago, inside a building that was supposed to be the safest place in the city, over 250 people walked through the doors on what felt like an ordinary Wednesday morning. Doctors, nurses, patients who had come to get better. None of them had any idea that within a few hours, they would be living through the deadliest hospital disaster in American history. Not from a raging fire, not from a collapse, but from something they could not see, could not smell in time, and could not outrun. If you want to understand how an entire hospital became a death trap in less than 30 minutes, stay with us until the very end, because the full picture is something most people have never heard, and every part of this story matters. Like and subscribe, because this is the kind of history that deserves to be told properly. To understand what happened on that morning, you first have to understand the world it happened in. Cleveland in the 1920s was not the city most people picture today. It was loud, ambitious, and growing at a pace that felt almost electric. It was one of the largest industrial cities in the entire United States, sitting on the southern shore of Lake Erie, with steel mills and factories pumping smoke into the sky, and a population that had exploded in the decades following the Civil War. Euclid Avenue, the grand boulevard that cut through the heart of the city, was lined with the kind of architecture that announced prosperity. Banks, department stores, office buildings. It was a city that believed in itself, and it was a city that was starting to believe in modern medicine. That belief had a very specific address, the corner of Euclid Avenue and East 93rd Street. That was where, in the winter of 1921, a four-story brick building opened its doors for the first time and changed how medicine in America would be practiced. It was called the Cleveland Clinic Foundation, and the four men who built it were not ordinary doctors. Three of them, George Kreil, Frank Bunce, and William Lower, had known each other for decades. They had come up through the same hospitals, taught at the same medical schools, and shared the same deep frustration with the way medicine worked at the time. Most doctors in the early 20th century practiced alone, each in their own office, each guarding their own patients, each limited by whatever specialty they happened to know. If a patient needed more than one kind of care, they were passed around like a problem no one wanted to fully solve. Kreil, Bunce, and Lower believed there was a better way, but it took a world war to show them exactly what it looked like. When the United States entered World War I, all three of them were sent to France as part of what became known as the Lakeside Unit, a medical team assembled from Cleveland's best doctors and attached to the British Army near the French city of Rouen. What they witnessed there changed everything they thought they knew about organizing medical care. The military hospital model was unlike anything back home. Specialists from every discipline worked side by side in the same building, communicating constantly, sharing knowledge, treating the same patients as a team. The results were remarkable given the brutal conditions of the Western Front. And somewhere in the exhaustion and the mud and the constant stream of wounded men, Kreil looked at his colleagues, and the three of them understood that this was what they wanted to build when they went home. They recruited a fourth partner after the war, a physician named John Phillips, who had not been part of the Lakeside Unit, but whose reputation in internal medicine and pediatrics in Cleveland was exceptional. Phillips was quiet and precise, where Kreil was electric and expansive. He was the kind of doctor who was described by colleagues as silent, confident, and unshakable. Together, the four of them pooled their resources, purchased land on Euclid Avenue, and constructed a building designed around their shared vision. A place where medicine and surgery and research would all happen under one roof, where a patient with no money would receive the same quality of care as the wealthiest person in the city, and where a portion of every dollar earned would go directly back into research and education. It was a radical idea for 1921, and a significant part of the medical establishment in Cleveland tried to stop them. But the four founders were too well-respected, too well-connected, and too determined. The building they opened was 4 stories tall, built around a central atrium with a large glass skylight at the very top that let natural light pour down through the middle of the structure. The floors were designed for the movement of patients, with corridors connecting examination rooms, waiting areas, and offices in a way that felt modern and efficient. By 1924, they had added a hospital wing with nearly 200 beds. By the end of the decade, the Cleveland Clinic had become one of the most recognized medical institutions in the country. It was a genuine success story, built from scratch by 4 men with a shared dream and an unshakable work ethic. What nobody paid enough attention to in all the growth and ambition and expansion of those 8 years was what was quietly accumulating in the sub-basement. To understand the disaster, you have to understand a single substance, and you have to understand why nobody truly feared it the way they should have. Nitrocellulose. It sounds like a chemistry term that belongs in a laboratory, but in the early 20th century, it was everywhere in medicine because it was the material used to make X-ray film. X-ray technology had only existed for a few decades by the 1920s, and it had already transformed medicine completely. For the first time in history, a doctor could look inside the human body without making a single incision. Broken bones, tumors, organ abnormalities, things that had been invisible for all of human history were suddenly visible on a piece of film held up to the light. Every hospital, every clinic worth its name was using X-rays constantly, and every X-ray produced was stored as a physical film record because those images were part of the patient's medical history and needed to be kept. The Cleveland Clinic had been operating for 8 years by the spring of 1929. 8 years of daily X-rays on hundreds of patients. The accumulation of all those film records was enormous. Estimates put the total weight of stored film in the subbasement somewhere between 4,000 and 10,000 pounds, depending on the source. That is potentially 5 tons of nitrocellulose sitting in a room that had originally been designed as a coal bin. It had no sprinkler system. It had no vault. It had poor ventilation. It was not sealed from the rest of the building's pipe and duct network. And it had several sources of potential heat, including a high-pressure steam pipe that ran along one wall and a bare light bulb hanging on an extension cord above the film stacks. The National Fire Protection Association had already issued guidelines recommending that nitrocellulose film be stored in a fire-resistant vault with automatic sprinklers and a ventilation system designed to carry fumes away from the building in case of ignition. These guidelines existed. They were known, but they were guidelines, not laws, and the Cleveland Clinic, like most hospitals at the time, had not followed them. The reason nitrocellulose is so dangerous comes down to its chemistry. It is one of the most unstable solid materials that existed in widespread civilian use at that time. It was originally developed as a precursor to explosives, and it shares a fundamental trait with those explosives. It contains its own oxygen within its molecular structure. That means it does not need air to burn. You cannot smother it. You cannot cut off its fuel supply the way you would with an ordinary fire, because the oxygen is already built in. And when it burns, even at relatively low temperatures, it does not just produce smoke. It produces a combination of gases so toxic that military chemists had spent years working out how to deploy them on battlefields. The gases released by burning nitrocellulose film include phosgene, which was responsible for the majority of chemical warfare deaths in World War I. They also include carbon monoxide, nitric oxide, and methyl chloride. Breathe any meaningful quantity of that mixture, and the damage begins immediately, attacking the lining of the lungs, causing them to fill with fluid, making every breath shallower and more desperate than the last. The visible symptom, the one that would leave witnesses unable to speak, was that the faces of anyone who had inhaled the gas began to turn yellowish-brown within minutes. None of this was secret information in 1929. The chemistry was understood. The danger was on record. The film was stored anyway, in the dark, in the basement, directly connected through pipe chases and ventilation shafts to every single room in the building above. Wednesday, May 15th, 1929. The clinic opened at its usual hour, and by mid-morning the building was in the middle of its busiest part of the day. Doctors moving between examination rooms. Nurses carrying charts. Patients sitting in waiting areas on every floor. The noise and movement of a functioning hospital doing what a hospital is supposed to do. In the subbasement, a routine maintenance job had been underway since early morning. A steam fitter named Buffery Boggs had arrived to repair a leaking high-pressure steam pipe in the X-ray film storage room. It was exactly the kind of job that happens in any building on any given day. He stripped some insulation from the pipe, recognized that he needed to shut off the steam before completing the repair, left the room to turn off the supply line, and waited for the pipe to cool down enough to work safely. This was standard procedure. There was nothing unusual about any of it. When Boggs came back to the storage room around mid-morning, he did not find a cool, quiet room waiting for a simple repair. He walked into a cloud of thick yellowish-brown smoke that had already filled the space. The film had ignited. He grabbed a fire extinguisher that was available in the room and tried to fight the burning material, but the extinguisher did nothing useful against nitrocellulose. Within moments, a small explosion expelled him backward. He and a custodian who had been assisting him stumbled toward a basement window, and a second blast threw them both through it, out onto the ground outside the building. They scrambled to their feet and ran. Both of them survived. Inside the building, at that moment, almost nothing seemed wrong to the people on the floors above. The subbasement was below the main basement. The noise of the first small explosions was muffled by the structure of the building. People went about their work. And in the walls, in the pipes, in the network of chases and shafts that connected the mechanical room to every corner of the four-story structure, the gas was already moving. This was what made the Cleveland Clinic disaster different from almost every other catastrophe in American history up to that point. There was no visible fire spreading across a floor. There were no flames climbing walls that people could see and react to. The building's own infrastructure, the same system of pipes and ventilation shafts that heated the rooms in winter and moved air through the building in summer, had become a delivery mechanism for a chemical weapon. The gas traveled silently through channels hidden inside the walls and ceilings, emerging into corridors and rooms without any warning. On the third floor, a stair door was being held open by a foot latch, a small metal latch that someone had engaged to keep the door from swinging shut during the morning traffic. That open door allowed the gas to flood the entire third floor more rapidly than anywhere else in the building. People on that floor began to feel it before they understood what was happening. At approximately 11:30 in the morning, the hollow center of the atrium had filled with gas under increasing pressure from the heat building below. The clock on the third floor balcony stopped. Then came the explosion that the whole city heard. It was not one sound. It was a sequence, a series of detonations that witnesses described as being like a ton of dynamite going off in rapid succession. The first major blast sent the poisonous cloud surging upward and outward through every part of the building. The second, following within seconds, shattered the enormous glass skylight at the top of the atrium, a skylight measuring 32 feet by 40 feet, and blasted the glass across the street. The force of the skylight explosion had a strange, terrible duality to it. It sent the toxic vapor rushing through the upper floors of the building with renewed violence, but also created a massive opening at the top of the atrium through which some of the gas could now escape. That opening saved lives. It also came too late for many of the people already inside. The doors of the building buckled from the pressure differential as gas was sucked toward the opening above. Windows shattered outward. And on Euclid Avenue, people who had been going about their morning stopped and stared at a building that was now obscured by a dense, yellowish-brown cloud hanging over and around it like something out of nightmare. A police officer named Henry Thorpe, who had been walking his beat 2 blocks away, heard the first blast and immediately called in the alarm before running toward the building. A block away, the gas hit him and temporarily blinded him. Inside, the scene was beyond anything the emergency services of 1929 were equipped to handle. People were collapsing in hallways. Others were found slumped in stairwells, having made it almost to safety before the gas overwhelmed them. The stairways, the routes that anyone instinctively takes when a building is in danger, had become killing corridors, dense with the invisible vapor that did its damage in seconds. Battalion Fire Chief James Flynn and his driver were among the first responders to enter the building. They made it to the roof and cut through to a stairway, dropping a ladder to the fourth floor landing and finding a row of bodies on the stairs below. A doctor, a nurse, and others arranged in the silent posture of people who had simply stopped mid-step. Out on the lawn in front of the building, a scene was forming that no one who witnessed it ever forgot. Bodies were being carried out and laid on the grass. Stretchers ran out almost immediately. People ran to neighboring houses and porches and brought back sofas and settees to use in their place. Doctors who had been working in other parts of the campus, which included buildings separated from the main clinic, arrived to find their colleagues on the ground. Dr. George Kreil, one of the founders of the clinic, had been performing surgery in a separate building when the explosion happened. He finished the operation, closed his patient, and walked to the main building. He was a man who had spent years in the worst military hospitals of World War I, who had operated in field conditions under artillery fire, who had seen more suffering than almost any doctor of his generation. He looked at the scene on the lawn and later wrote, "I saw nothing in France so terrible. It was a crucible. What he recognized immediately And what other doctors present that day recognized was the nature of the gas. The yellow-brown discoloration of the faces, the particular way the lungs were failing, the pattern of collapse. It all pointed directly to phosgene. These doctors had treated phosgene victims on the Western Front. The clinic that had been born from the lessons of wartime medicine was now dealing with a wartime chemical agent. In peacetime, in the middle of a city, in a building designed to save lives. The firefighters who arrived in force tried to use their hoses on the burning film in the basement. This was the rational thing to do. It was also because of the specific chemistry of nitrocellulose, making things worse. Nitrocellulose does not need external oxygen to sustain combustion. It burns even when completely submerged in water. Every stream of water directed at the burning film produced more poisonous smoke, and that smoke fed back into the building's ventilation network and continued killing. Some firefighters on the scene attempted to use an oxygen helmet that was available, understanding that respiratory protection was essential. They could not adjust the equipment correctly and abandoned it. The gas mask that would have allowed first responders to enter the building safely and pull people out did not exist as standard emergency equipment in 1929. They were a military tool, and no one had thought to make them part of a city's fire department kit. In the middle of everything that was happening inside that building, while people were collapsing and the gas was moving through every corridor, a handful of individuals made decisions that deserve to be remembered by name. Gladys Gibson was the clinic's telephone operator. Her switchboard was in the main building. When the gas began spreading and people started to understand that something catastrophic was happening, Gladys Gibson stayed at her post. She did not leave. There was a window just a few feet away from her position that she could have climbed through to reach the street in safety. Instead, she stayed at the switchboard and continued connecting calls throughout the building, plugging socket after socket, setting every line she could reach ringing with alarm, trying to warn anyone who might not yet know what was happening. She collapsed at her desk with the cords still plugged in. She died there. William Brownlow was the head of the clinic's art and photography department. He had taken the day off that morning, which meant he was not scheduled to be in the building at all. He came back for a forgotten item, planning to spend only a few minutes before leaving again. He was inside when the main explosion happened. He looked at the situation, at the people trapped on the upper floors, and he chose to stay and help. He made his way to the third floor, the floor where the gas was thickest, and smashed a window to create an opening so that people inside could reach a ladder that firefighters had extended from below. He stood at that window and helped people through it. He breathed the gas during those minutes of effort. He later died from what he had inhaled. Edith Morgan had served as a nurse in the Lakeside unit in France. By 1929, she was working at the clinic as a receptionist, stationed in the main waiting room on a floor where the gas was already present when she understood what was happening. She spent her time trying to calm patients who were panicking and helping them find their way to exits. She remained in the building doing this work until she herself collapsed. She was carried out and survived, but only barely. And then there was Officer Ernest Staub. He was a police officer who was among the first responders on the scene. Unlike the firefighters who were managing the exterior and the fire in the basement, Staub went into the building and kept going back in. He would enter the gas-filled corridors, find a victim who was still alive, carry them out, lay them on the lawn, and go back in again. He did this 21 times. 21 people carried out to the grass and to the possibility of survival, one, by a single man who understood perfectly well what he was breathing each time he crossed back through that door. When he finally came back out after the 21st rescue, he looked fine. He stood on the street, spoke to people, seemed physically unharmed. He went home. He collapsed later that day while working in his garden, and the gas that had been accumulating in his lungs over hours of repeated exposure finally overcame him. He was hospitalized and placed under an oxygen tent, and contrary to what the newspapers reported the following morning, he did not die. He survived, though with lasting health problems, and he continued working as a detective in the Cleveland Police Department for another 25 years. Oxygen was the only medical treatment that had any meaningful effect on the victims of gas inhalation, and the demand for it that afternoon became so acute that physicians were sending out appeals to every hospital and medical supplier in the city, afraid that Cleveland's entire supply of oxygen might run out before the crisis was over. The people who died did not all die quickly. Some collapsed within minutes. Others walked out of the building apparently functional and died hours later, or even days later, as the damage to their lungs progressed beyond the body's ability to compensate. The gas had done its chemical work even in amounts that seemed, at the moment of exposure, too small to be immediately incapacitating. The death toll climbed steadily through the afternoon and into the following days. In the end, 123 people died. 80 of them were patients and visitors who had come to the clinic seeking care. 43 were clinic employees, people who had shown up to work that morning and never came home. Among the dead was Dr. John Phillips, one of the 4 founders of the Cleveland Clinic, the quiet, precise internist who had been in his office on the 3rd floor when the gas flooded in. The headline in the newspaper the day after was short and stark: Clinic death toll at 120. Blast remains mystery. Within hours of the disaster, investigators from city, state, and federal agencies were already at the scene. Ultimately, 12 separate investigating bodies examined the evidence, interviewed survivors, and tried to determine exactly what had happened and who, if anyone, was responsible. The National Board of Fire Underwriters, the Ohio Inspection Bureau, local commissions, all of them working independently, all of them reaching the same central conclusion about the film, the gas, and the ventilation system. And yet, when it came to assigning blame, they found themselves confronting a deeply uncomfortable truth. Everything that had been done with that film storage was legal. The way the subbasement had been repurposed, the lack of sprinklers, the absence of a sealed vault, the proximity of heat sources to the film stacks. None of it violated any law or regulation that existed at the time. The National Fire Protection Association had issued recommendations, but recommendations are not laws. Hospitals across the entire country were storing nitrocellulose film in similar conditions. Cleveland was not unusual. It was representative. The investigation identified 3 possible causes for the initial ignition: the heat from the steam pipe that Boggs had been repairing, the bare light bulb hanging over the film stacks, or a discarded cigarette or match from someone who had been in the room earlier. Investigators could not definitively prove which of the 3 was responsible, and after exhaustive examination, no single cause was ever established with certainty. The National Fire Protection Association's final report described the storage arrangement in a way that has been quoted ever since. It said that the most diabolical cunning could scarcely have devised an arrangement more surely calculated to spread death throughout the building. And yet no one had intended it. The arrangement had grown organically, year by year, film envelope by film envelope, in a room that had been reassigned without anyone fully accounting for what they were putting into it. Cleveland Clinic was officially absolved of legal responsibility. The lawsuits that were filed against the institution, and there were many, totaling claims of several $1 million, were settled for a fraction of that amount, paid without any admission of fault. The surviving founders, George Cryle and William Lower, faced something more complicated than a legal judgment. They faced the weight of having built the building, having overseen its operations, and having lost a colleague and more than 100 people under their roof. Cryle was back in the operating room 3 days after the disaster. When his wife asked how he could return so quickly, he told her something that became the sentence most often associated with his response to the catastrophe. He told her that grief would be defeat. The community of Cleveland responded in a way that matched the scale of what had happened. A philanthropist named Samuel Mather assembled a committee of community leaders to help the clinic reestablish itself. Donations poured in from across the city, eventually totaling more than $30,000, an enormous sum at the time. The clinic's leadership accepted the generosity with gratitude, used temporary space in a donated dormitory across the street, and resumed seeing patients within 5 days of the disaster, with over 300 patients registering immediately. Then they returned the donated money, with interest, and chose to finance their own recovery. That decision said something about the character of the institution that the founders had built. The original building was gutted, debated, and ultimately kept. There was serious discussion about whether it should be demolished entirely. Cryle believed it could be saved and repurposed, and he was right. It was renovated throughout 1930, redesigned so that it no longer resembled its original form, converted to administrative use to separate it from the emotional association with patient care, and eventually became part of the clinic's expanding campus. It still stands today, known as the T Building, incorporated into one of the most respected medical centers in the world. But the most significant consequences of May 15, 1929 were not confined to Euclid Avenue. They spread across the entire country because the people who investigated the disaster understood that what had happened in Cleveland had not happened because Cleveland was careless or negligent beyond the norm. It had happened because the norm was not safe. Every hospital in America that used X-ray film, which meant virtually every hospital in America, was operating under the same conditions. The rules needed to change everywhere, not just in one building in one city. The changes came. New federal and national standards were developed for the storage and labeling of hazardous materials, specifically targeting nitrocellulose film. The guidelines that had been voluntary suggestions became binding requirements. Film stored in hospitals had to be kept in fire-resistant vaults, with proper ventilation systems designed to carry fumes away from occupied spaces rather than through them. The city of Cleveland established a municipal ambulance service because the disaster had exposed the absence of organized emergency transport as a gap that had cost lives when victims needed to be moved quickly. Fire departments were required to equip their personnel with gas masks as standard gear because the men who had entered the Cleveland Clinic that morning had done so breathing the same air as the people they were trying to save. The oxygen helmet that a firefighter had tried and failed to adjust during the disaster became the model for equipment improvements that would eventually protect every emergency responder in the country. Over the following decade, nitrocellulose X-ray film was gradually replaced throughout the medical industry with a far safer alternative called cellulose acetate film, sometimes simply called safety film. It did not produce toxic gases when it burned. It was not a chemical weapon waiting to be ignited. Its adoption was not purely a response to Cleveland, as researchers have been working on it for years, but the disaster gave the transition an urgency that had not existed before. Dr. John Phillips, who died in his third-floor office on that Wednesday morning, was mourned not just as a colleague and founder, but as the particular kind of physician that the Cleveland Clinic had been built to cultivate: thoughtful, collaborative, dedicated to the patient above all else. His absence was felt in a way that could not be replaced. George Cryle continued to practice and lead the institution for more than a decade after the disaster. William Lower, the last surviving founder, did not retire until 1941. He died in 1948, having spent nearly 30 years building something from nothing and then watching it survive a catastrophe that would have ended most institutions. The Cleveland Clinic that exists today, which is one of the top-ranked hospitals in the United States and treats patients from across the world, was rebuilt from the ashes of that morning. The people who use it today, the patients who receive treatment in its gleaming modern buildings, are in some sense the beneficiaries of the tragedy that almost destroyed it, because the disaster forced the medical world to confront the danger it had been ignoring and to change. 123 people walked into a hospital on an ordinary Wednesday morning and did not come home. They were patients hoping to get better, employees who had shown up to do their jobs, a founder who believed in a vision of medicine that was worth building. The building where it happened still stands. The institution survived. And the rules that govern how every hospital in America stores hazardous materials, how every fire department equips its responders, how every city organizes its emergency services, all of those rules were written, at least in part, in a memory of what was lost on Euclid Avenue in the spring of 1929. This is the story that most people have never fully heard. Now you have.